Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please be seated.
Buenas tardes. Vamos a retomar los trabajos, por favor.
Let us resume our work, ladies and gentlemen.
Nos corresponde iniciar la sesión especial
We will now have the special meeting on Beijing and challenges for Latin America and the Caribbean. This is a very long panel with ample participation, and the moderator will be Carolina Plaza from our gender ministry. You have the floor. Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome to my lovely country, as lovely as your countries, most surely. We'll now begin with this very busy afternoon, and we'll begin with a great woman whom I've been lucky to talk to, Maria Baeza. Maria Noel Baeza, you well know her. She's a general director of UN Women for America. She has a PhD in law and social sciences from Uruguay University and has a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University. She entered UN Women as general director in June 2019. She has previously worked at UN Women's headquarters in New York. She was director of the Service Office's global portfolio at UN Office on Services for Projects. And for 14 years, she worked in the development program for UN. Before entering UN, she worked in foreign relations ministries from Uruguay. Maria Noel, it's an honor to have you here with us, and you have 10 minutes just to give us a general outlook on this topic. Thank you, Carolina. Indeed, it's a pleasure for me to be here in the same room with such distinguished personalities. Let me talk about the report that we have prepared together with ECLAC that analyzes the regional trends coming from the 27 national reports that have covered this request for information that we made on the progress of Beijing. And I wanted to talk about this because I know that many of you hadn't been born when we designed Beijing platform. So it's very important that you remember some of the topics. Yes, I had been born there for quite some time then. Now let us look at the progress and goals. Let me say that of these 12 topics, the national reports and the rest of the material, we have been focusing inclusive development, prosperity, decent work, social protection, eradication of violence, political participation, and safety and the environment. So we have tried to summarize all of this to make information even simpler to understand. Let's start with inclusive development. This is deals with the lack of financial inclusion for women. Actually, they are financially excluded. Poverty affects women more than anyone else, as we have already heard these couple of days, and the indicators are getting worse and worse. And then decent job, and we heard here that we only have 29.4 women who don't have any income of their own. I've just come from a meeting of a multinational data called Isoquitos, and there we heard from an expert that 32.5% of women are heads of households, and 30% men are heads of households. So we see the way families are evolving. the situation has changed, and this is the new status of families in the region. As to social protection, we heard so much of at ECLA's presentation, women have less access and receive lower income benefits. Many women have no protection whatsoever. Some countries have said that up to 65% of women are in the informal sector. So this is something that requires urgent measures. And we also see that as a region, we must prepare for the future of the labor world. This is something that we must deal with. And naturally, health in terms of sexual and reproductive health. Now, naturally, violence. This worries all of us. Much has been accomplished, I know that. And here, I wanted to publish this. Let us start with the typification of femicide that just didn't exist in the past, and this region is pioneer. Strategies for women who have disappeared, that's another important topic. Coordination between institutions and the different players that are part of the judicial system, emergency centers, campaigns to raise awareness. In short, violence against women is out there in the hands of the media and of the political world. Naturally, not enough budget has been allocated, but it's here to stay. And we still have to study further the reasons behind this violence. Political participation, there's a big deficit here. Not a single woman is president of a country in the region. In the Caribbean, we have a first ministers of state, and we must congratulate the Caribbean on this. Barbados, Grenada, St. Vincent, Grenadines, and Trinidad and Tobago have women who are secretaries of state. So they save our faces so that in the region, at least, we have women who come to the higher levels of government. But look at this deficit. At local governments, only 15% of the mayors are women. We cannot reach this parity if not even in local elections they vote for women. So we must redouble efforts so that we have indigenous women, Afro-descendants, and true women may have access to decision-making positions. And naturally, locally, we're talking about mayors, lady mayors. Now, in Congress, let us recall that the 31% of the parliament positions are in the hands of women, but that in some countries it's not even 19%. In Haiti, there's one single woman in Congress. So the average is always misleading, but this is what we have for the region. Evidently, peace and safety. This becomes of the utmost importance during political crises and social crises that we're going through right now. That is why it's so important to once more bring back this kind of agenda to the debate of all of our countries. Migration. This is key, as Alicia well said. What about the rights towards Social Security for the workers in our countries, and how do we use different instruments to reach that? Now, let us take a look at the way our countries are investing in the protection of the environment. 0.1% of GDP. That is nil. But it's even worse when we look at how much is invested in women. And this is very important because if we see, as ECLAC says, we must talk about women and the environment, how we are going to get women from their own territories are the ones who will defend the environment. But with this kind of investment, we won't get far. And then we have the investment on gender mechanisms. Things are even worse here. Here we have the share of the total state budget as allocated to women's ministries. This has been worse than UN Women. We don't even get to 0.0% of the general budget in these countries. So it's a negative figure. It's even worse than with the environment. And this is of great concern. That is, that in the Santiago commitment, we must have more funds for all of the agencies related to gender, whether they be ministries or associations. We must fight for this kind of budget, and we must struggle with conviction. Otherwise, we will never reach the equality that we aim for in 2030. And then we have equality plans, budgets with a gender perspective, intersectional focus. This is all part of the report. This dialogue is already taking place in our region, as we are doing right here today. We are also measuring the use of time. Alicia talked about this. Thanks to this kind of measurement and data, we are able to know how much women work on a free basis and comparing to men. And then we have the redistribution, the reduction, and the recognition of paid work. And here we also see the economic value of unpaid work, and this comes from Mexico, by the way. The manufacturing industry in Mexico is responsible for 18.6% of GDP. Trade, 17. Agriculture, 3.5%. Do you know what is the figure for unpaid work? 20% of GDP. This means that men and women who are not wage earners hold on their backs the development of the country. This must change. And here we have Nadine, we have the foreign ministry with this feminist policy in this wonderful state. And it's an honor to say that Mexico was the first country. And right here next to me is the vice minister who certainly had something to do with this accomplishment. Legislation. Things have been improving here for the region. Legislation to get rid of violence, not only recognizing violence and femicides, but also realizing that the violence that takes place during the women's whole life cycle. As of the moment she leaves home to go to work, out in public transportation, on the streets, she gets to work and she's harassed on the job. All of this must be recognized, especially from a legal standpoint, because we don't want women to be free. We want women to be free to take up any kind of job she wants and move around freely without being harassed. And it's important to admit, though, that we have had innovative progress in the region, and we're very happy for that. But the glass is half full. We must continue to implement these laws and bring in new budget for these national social services that are so needed. Political participation, all of this action, this activity in the region has empowered women from a political and economic standpoint, at least to a certain extent, as we read in the report. But there are differences between countries. In the Caribbean countries, strong action has been adopted in health, sexual reproductive health. In Central America, there are policies for entrepreneurship. They are in the onset, yes, and hopefully more focused on indigenous women. In the Andean countries, policies have been adopted to eradicate extreme poverty. And in the Southern Cone, we have household women workers, the rights on the job, and naturally the care, paid work. But there's so many challenges we faced. These are some of them. First, and number one, the right to a life free of violence and discrimination. amongst all of the topics related to discrimination against ethnical group, race, social or sexual orientation, etc., free of violence and all kinds of discrimination. 40 years ago, the Convention on all CEDAW, wanting to abolish all sorts of discrimination, already talked about this, and we must watch closely CEDAW's recommendations to our countries to demand of our countries that these action plans be adopted to start eliminating discrimination, hopefully before 2030. Then we have economic, social, and cultural rights, social security, financial digital inclusion. This is well pointed out by ECLEC's report, and you yourselves talk about it. It is indeed a challenge. And we have collective rights, environmental rights, sex reproductive rights, the recognition of the regulatory frameworks, especially in education, and finally, civil and political rights. Here we have tremendous deficit. One of the most important topics for us is the indivisibility of women's rights. And this requires comprehensive answers. More and more, the state must work in an interagency, interministerial fashion. In turn, this perspective, looking at women's needs, will be better met. We also have challenges for the implementation of policies towards equality, institutionality, financing, IT. Many countries, unfortunately, don't have integrated information systems, not even accounting for femicide. We must work on this, how to get good information systems so that we may have data and thus better focus public policy. And naturally, the participation of civil society. That is fundamental in order to monitor, to see whether the public policies are functioning accordingly and protecting women's rights. Synergies between regional and world commitments. Here we see that we cannot work solo here. Amongst nations, governments and civil society, private sector, all sectors must be involved because it's a state issue. It's a national issue. Without equality in one agency, we cannot aspire for equality at the whole of society. Now let me wrap up, as we always do in UN Women, talking about Equality Generation Forum. We must realize that we are not a generation that has had equality, but we must get equality to be a fact in the next decade. So we invite you all to come to Mexico. I'm sorry for inviting them on your behalf, but I invite you all to Mexico and then to France, to Paris, and actually to CSW. We have so many political events where we may raise our voices, and we invite that we raise our voices all together. Thank you. Thank you, Maria Noel. These were wonderful words. You spoke with depth and such conviction. I hope that by Friday we will sign an excellent agreement, as you have inspired us to do. Now, Gabriela Ramos. She is Director of Economic Development of the OECD. She's also taken up different positions in that organization, OECD, such as Assistant to General Secretary, and she has contributed a great deal to the launching of important initiatives from OECD that have to do with the economic crisis, gender, skills, and development. 2006. There she became director of Mexican OECD offices for Latin America. And before that, she worked at the Mexican government. She was advisor to the Foreign Affairs Minister, and she was also assistant in Economy Ministry. She has worked at the Ibero-American University, and she has a master's degree from Harvard. Gabriela, you have the floor.
Muchísimas gracias y bueno, estoy aquí con
Thank you very much. And here I am with all of you. And very modestly, because as we say at the OECD with regard to gender and inclusion, the OECD always would like an Oscar as the best UN support staff. And that is why I'm here, support, and of course for ECLAC, which is so much of a leader. We are true gender champions, and so that is how we are here to take part. But we would like to join in with a voice that has something to say about what has been put to us. What are the challenges, the advances, and where are we headed? This was already shown by Maria Noel, and I believe that if we could sum up what is the situation in Latin America and around the world, because the OECD has the countries, some of the most advanced countries, with have no challenges like in Latin America. Maybe the expression in Latin America is easy to see, but the discrimination exists everywhere. But there are shades to this and some positive things as well, already mentioned. From our viewpoint, what encourages us is that in relation to economic empowerment, there's been truly very significant investment by all countries. Today, in terms of education, the level of schooling of girls and boys in most countries is similar. Today, girls or young girls reach higher levels of schooling or higher university degrees. Of course, we do have the sort of disciplines chosen by girls, and of course, we're placed in areas of lower income or lower impact. But at the end of the day, we must recognize that Latin American countries have made a tremendous effort to move ahead with the education of women. And then employment. I believe it has been important, this progress, the fact that the labor market share is 50%, and this is very positive. We used to be at 40 or under 40 just a few decades ago, and today at 50. So, of course, it is still surprising that we still have this gap of 27 points in comparison to men. But the quality of women's work is less. And the professional trajectory of women is full of ups and downs and discontinuities that prevent them from fully developing their potential. And also the fact that we are also doing jobs that are less paid or with a lower pay. And then in the economic agenda, there's also been support and advancement. And in terms of wages, well, I find it very enthusing when there are financial instruments to advance the gender agenda, because that's where we can have the greatest impact. The fact that BlackRock, the very important investment fund, said that they are not going to invest in companies that do not have at least one woman in the board. And that is very important, because this means that the agenda of women is advancing. But of course, leadership. Leadership is good. And once again, Undersecretary Mexico, with its parity Congress, shows that it is possible. This, that the women do not exist, that we cannot find them, that the productivity is going to drop, that we're going to be, as they were saying to me, unfortunately, the president of the Mexican Congress, when the quota was adopted, that we're going to be full of incompetent women, without recognizing that we're full of incompetent men, and without any quota at all. Yes. And they get in without even a filter. Nobody asks them if they have a competence or not. But at least we women get there, and we also get there to show that we are able to advance with the agenda. And this is important, because I would like you to be enthused with this idea. Information on Mexico. The quota is announced. The quota comes in. Congress continues to be equally productive or more, with a number of initiatives adopted, the same or more, good quality. Still something to do for women to be in the most important commissions in the Congress. But, well, okay. At the end of the day, what these women are doing in Congress is to approve legislation that requests gender equity at all levels of government. And this is going to be a fundamental change, together with a feminist policy adopted by the government of President López Obrador. But this is happening in many of our countries, and many of your countries have quotas, and many of those countries are moving ahead with these levels. And so I think that we've also made significant progress, partly in the private sector. And there I would say, well, what's happening with the private sector? Why should we have 15% of women in leadership positions? Or why 5% of women in managerial level? In government, 30%. And management levels in companies, only 20%, 5%. I think that there is an issue that we need to address, because, of course, the private sector has a long way to go, not only in Latin America, around the world. In general, the private sector is lagging behind. I think that we have advanced in understanding which are the policy tools and for public and private intervention to move ahead with this sort of agenda. The quotas, as I was saying, whether you like it or not, those countries that do have more equity have used affirmative action, be they goals or quotas. Investing in early education, eradicating legislation that's harmful to women, and topics that have to do with formal discrimination and institutional discrimination that we need to overcome. Where do I see the most important topic? And you know this better than us. And that is how to change mentalities. We presented this study, once again, at the OECD, where we have a book on good and bad practices. And this report says that in the region of Latin America, 50% of the population still thinks that when mothers work, children suffer. 30% of families still think that women cannot earn more than men if we want more family peace, and so on and so on. This issue of the mentalities, I believe, is very relevant. One of the things that I would propose here, and that has been used by some countries, once again, including Mexico and a few others in the region as well, and that is doing away with the gender stereotypes in textbooks and turning around this or investing in teachers. I think this is essential if you want to change people's mentalities. Priorities, violence. I've said it already. Violence, violence, and violence. I wouldn't mention any other. In the coming week at the OECD, we're going to have a conference on violence. I don't know why 1 in 4 women around the world, and in some region 2, and even 3 out of 4 women must suffer violence or harassment. Why should we justify this? Why 1 out of every 4, or 2 out of 4, or 3 out of 4 justify the violence they suffer? And why should we have mechanisms to address this? That are mechanisms that are so disconnected, so inefficient, and so limited in terms of what they should do, and that is to protect the integrity of a person, because there is something that the state must do, is to protect the integrity of a person, and it is truly unacceptable. This should continue to happen everywhere. And then the other theme is toxic masculinities. We must work with children. It is very important to work with boys if we want to change this. And then the last priority, well, there are many priorities, but another theme that is of concern to us in terms of the technological revolution, the fact that women are not present in the digital world. And you all know it, 250 million less women connected to iPhones or smartphones. But I would just like to say that 80% of the new software, the apps that are being made today, are made by teams of men, solely men. And I think that here we have many pacifist men, but you say, well, why are there so many games based on violence? 80%. We are totally absent from digital technology. And so that we need more girls in ICTs and increasing the confidence among girls regarding their capacities, because it's another thing. Families always expect less from girls, and families always instigate this of having less confidence in themselves. So this is an important agenda, as I was saying at the start. At the end of the day, a lot of progress, yes. A lot of enthusiasm, yes. a lot of challenges, yes, but we already know how these roads are paved and how to move ahead. And so to be celebrating the 25th anniversary could give us the added drive to close these gaps that are unacceptable in this modern world. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Gabriel.
Thank you, Gabriela, for sharing the experience and the challenges. Now, I would just like to add that in the change of mentality that you're speaking of, we're talking about the cultural change of people and public institutions. We have a lot to do. Thank you very much, Graciela, and I hope you have a good trip back. That's why we changed the order. Now, Marta Delgado Peralta is the next speaker, Under Secretary for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights at the Secretariat of Foreign Affairs in Mexico. Marta obtained a master's in literal arts in the field of sustainability, University of Harvard. She's developed her professional career in the area of the environment, different sectors, government, civil society. And in the last 25 years, she's been responsible for the design and instrumentalization of the Mexican foreign policy before international agencies and has coordinated the policy for opening and coordination with international system of human rights, dialogue with civil society organizations, and coordination with the participation of Mexico in Forum on the Environment and Climate Change, gender, and the promotion of democracy, as well as the agenda for sustainable peace. Marta, the floor is yours. Well, I thank everyone. I would like to greet those who are with me here. But I believe that we have here a panel with a lot of information and very important data. This platform is indispensable to assess what we have gained over the last 25 years and what's still missing. I don't know if we need to embark on a race or if in the next 10 years there's still to go until we need to meet the 2030 agenda. Maybe we should treble our pace. I don't know. But I do feel that this year, 2020, is a very important moment. It is 20 years since the adoption of the Resolution 1325 on the Security Council. Now, this is the last picture I wanted to show you. This is the last one. But I wanted to urge young people to join in. I went to Beijing in '95, and very young, yes. And my entire youth and my adult life I have spent thinking that we will meet the Beijing platform. But today we are here thinking there's so far still to go. But, well, the truth is that we're very hopeful that this movement of young, aware people, and the truth is that this awareness is springing up in so many environments among the environmentalists, which is where I trained, and I also see it. This feminist and I, we were environmentalist activists, and I've seen these two causes for at least 25 years, growing up together, and with challenges so different, yes, because women have done the most important revolution in the history of humanity. Despite all the challenges that we're seeing today, the lags, what we're still short of doing, we're lagging behind in everything, 100 years ago, the situation was so much worse. And I think it is very important to recognize that without a single drop of blood, we women have today a far more appropriate space open to us. This doesn't mean to say that everything is fine, but we must recognize that this women's revolution in the 20th century has been incredible. We've not achieved the same thing in other causes. No, on the contrary, in other causes, we are truly, the trend is deteriorating. the environment. The data have a downward slope. Each time more pollution, each time more extraction, each time more burning of CO2. But with women, no. Although we still have 35, 50%, 20% to go, we're still ahead and advancing. And I think that this halt in the way towards 2030 is very important. It'll soon be 10 years since the creation of UN Women, 25 years since Beijing. And the declaration of the Beijing Plan of Action is one of the most progressive documents for the progress of the rights of women and girls, and is still a very relevant roadmap in order to achieve gender equality around the world. And also, I believe that now the relevance of participation by the civil society is even greater, and that inclusion of the private sector, of the academics, of communicators in these discussions is very healthy. Our region has always been at the forefront of including the gender perspective in the 2030 Agenda and design of SDG 5. Latin America and the Caribbean is a region where the voice, I think, says important things in this context, multilateral context. However, I think that this is a table very important to us, women from Latin America and the Caribbean, because when we go to international fora, there's always a stronger voice that gets more rights. For example, I have a much larger delegation and they cover everything at the same time. And I think that we in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's very important to be more vocal at international fora with our agenda, which is very similar but not the same. And it's not the same because here we have inequality gaps that do not exist in the developed world. There is a number of people living in poverty and extreme poverty that does not exist in the developed world. And the great majority of these countries, there are more women than men in that situation. And so, the UN Women report and ECLAC report, Beijing plus 25, show that important progress has been made, yes, but it's been slow and it's not been constant. And maybe this year is the right moment for this to be clarified for all, and that our own specific needs in our region may be put up as priority at multilateral level. I believe that we have economic cycles and political cycles in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean that are also having an impact on the living conditions of women, their well-being, the possibility for development, and that we should also create regional solidarity. Someday, it will be the Mexican women that have a problem, other days, other countries. But at the end of the day, I think it is important to speak of the women of Venezuela, the women of Bolivia, the women in Ecuador, now the women in Chile, and then in Brazil, that are facing certain issues that also have a particular incidence in policy. What's happening with our chances of achieving equality. The data is very important. According to the Gender Equality Observatory, the feminization of poverty has increased in the region. And it says that it went from 117.4 women per 100 to 120 from 2015 to 2017 in 2 years. And I think that the regression will not happen so quickly. And so I think that what we have here is a feeling of urgency regarding what's to be done. And so not only is this data important, maternal mortality, violence against women, political participation in some countries, as we were saying, well, now we're very happy because we have women in Congress in Mexico, the Senate, maybe the first head of government, and so on and so on. But I've seen countries that have had that and don't have it anymore. And we must see how. And I've also seen countries that have had more income for women and they no longer have it, and more education and more health, and today don't. And so we must recognize that this progress that we've achieved, although slow, must be consolidated, and we cannot take a step back. And all of this must be mainstreamed. And that is why I agree. A lot of what is recommended here, and it is the most of the obstacles are institutionality, culture, the awareness that we need for someone else not to come in that, no, now we're going to be full of incompetent women, and no way. Because to say something like that means to say that you must be part of a discriminatory culture. So, of course, I will conclude by inviting you. This is going to be the central message. Mexico struggled to host the forum. Nadine Gassman, director of the National Institute for Women, your server, and UN Women in Mexico will go to New York. We made a tremendous effort for it to be not only in France, but also in a country of the South and Latin America to launch the Forum on Generation and Equality.
It's important, not just because of Mexico. And why? Because we're very interested rather on the content of discussion than on declarations. That is perhaps the most glamorous part of it all. And I think the outcome is for sure. On May, we invited you to come. There are 5 groups that will be working, and Nadine and I will explain some of this. At 6 p.m., we have a side event to talk about that forum, its organization, and you're all invited to this side event. We'll be talking about the agenda, the methodology, etc. This will be only the beginning for us. The process will last till July, to close in Paris, July to the 10th, from the 6th to the 10th. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you there. Thank you, Marta. It's important to remember how we are such protagonists in terms of public policy in all of our countries. We will now give the floor to Damares Regina Alves. She's State Minister for Women, Family, and Human Rights in Brazil. Damares graduated from the law department from São Paulo University. She's an educator, she's an attorney, she's a parliamentary assistant and defender of human rights. She, in 1980, became one of the founders of the State Committee of CGPs and the National Movement for Boys and Girls, and they aim at protecting boys and girls from the streets. At the end of 1980, she acted to defend women's rights, who were fisher women and rural workers, and she's got more than 20 years. She is really has a role model on what is known in Brazil as pedophilia. You have the floor. Delegates, representatives from civil society, and all here present. This conference is here to hear each other, to listen to each other. We have been gathering for 40 years now, since 1977, the delegations, and we heard from Undersecretary, Deputy Secretary Delgado, much has been made, but things change. Democratic processes change, and the civil society also changes. The only thing that doesn't change at ECLAC and UN is the respect towards others and the possibility to listen to each other. Civil society has been heard yesterday. It will be heard this afternoon once more. The governments have also had their time, as well as the UN systems. We must safeguard our conference. We must safeguard this space, and we request that we all respect each other. You have the floor, madam. Thank you, Secretary. These are important expressions. So that's the only because that's the only way we may push ahead. Damaris, you have the floor. Good afternoon, Executive Secretary, authorities here present, and I am very thankful for that introduction and for your words. It is an honor for me to bring in the perspective of the new Brazil and its relationship with the Beijing platform. But before doing so, I will bring to you the Brazil we know of. There were 61,000 homicides per year in Brazil, and of this, more than 40 were women. One woman is murdered every 2 hours. That is the reality that we have in Brazil. This is an indication that Brazil was the worst country in South America to be born a girl, and the fourth in terms of children married. This is what we received. What to do about all of this? In order to face all sorts of violence and discrimination as well as prejudice against women, what to do for all of us to be together under Beijing, searching for a happy Brazil for everyone who is born a girl. I know what's like to be born a girl in Brazil. I was a victim of violence. When I was 6 years old, I was raped with tremendous violence, and we're working now tremendously to get that country that we inherited. That was the worst country for girls, will be the best country in the world to be born a girl. And the Brazilian government is heading in that direction. The current administration is committed towards the promotion and protection of human rights. The express vote that Brazil received in October 1919 to be elected in the Human Rights Council of UN strengthens our determination, and this is why we were elected for that UN system. Brazil is decided to get rid of all sorts of discrimination and violence against women and girls. Initiatives that aim at strengthening women's human rights and that promote equality between men and women bring in the principles and the priorities into the ministry, women's ministry. As of the onset, Brazil participated in the commitments taken up on the fourth conference on women in Peking. We participated actively in that conference and its follow-up, holding dialogues with civil society and getting all state powers to work in that, especially congressmen and representatives from state and municipal councils, and everything having to do with women's condition. At present, our government is implementing concrete measures for women. Let me give you an example. When we assumed power, only 9% of our municipalities had an office for women. So what our concrete offers, all of the municipalities in all the 60 and more thousand municipalities will have within each police office a special office only to receive women's complaints. So we're trying to build this, and but that would take so long, so we decided to change things. Every police office will have a special place to receive women. Thus, from 9%, we will reach 100% of municipalities with a special division and department to receive women. We have also been working in terms of traditional and native peoples. A country with more than 300 different groups, so speaking 274 different languages in Brazil, that aside from indigenous people, we have 28 traditional native peoples who were made invisible in Brazil, especially women belonging to these traditional groups. For example, we have 890,000 indigenous people in Brazil, but more than 1 million gypsies as well live in Brazil. And women gypsies in Brazil were not seen at all. The current administration is searching for all of the women that were invisible, and we are reaching them all so that no single women will be left behind in Brazil. Women who live in the coastal areas. We have cities in Brazil that between the town, the center of the town, and the outside neighborhoods, they have to travel hours by boat. There was a case when a woman had to travel 18 hours in a little boat, and she was hurt to reach care. And in order to do so, she had to have money to pay for the boat to reach the Office of Health Care. So these were women who were not visible. And the subjectification of women's violence is a reality. So I'm bringing these figures that are recorded. These are figures that are scary. Imagine under notification or these women who live by the coastal areas. But now we will have two mini boats that will be sent to the Amazons. And we want to have more data to fight this underreporting of women who suffer violence and who were invisible in Brazil. We are now working to have all women part of this care. Now, as to fighting violence, Maria Pia law, that is a benchmark, is being improved every day. We have a good group of women, and only in 2019, last year, 8 new laws were passed by President Bolsonaro to protect women. Amongst these, we have the compensation on the part of the aggressor of all damage that was applied to women in the single health system. The perpetrator will be made responsible to pay all of the gadget safety instruments such as a help button and ankle bracelets, electronic ankle bracelets, as well as the confiscation of firearms that are in the hands of the aggressor in cases of domestic violence. The preventive and protective measure, emergency measures for women who have suffered domestic and family violence. Now, in the past, a legal measure had been needed in order to help these women under family violences. But that is no longer the case. Now, it is now mandatory to inform on the condition of women with special needs and who have been victims of family violence. In the past, if a woman with special needs was a victim, wasn't informed, we didn't have that kind of segregation. Now we have a new Office for Human Rights, and we have a new call center that is called Call 180. In the past, a woman had to wait 1 whole hour to be attended. Now we are reaching a record of less than 30 seconds. This call center is showing reality. Violence against women with special needs in Brazil is indeed a fact, as well as amongst elderly. We now have indicators whereby the third better recording of violence against women goes against the elderly, older women. We are now fighting this kind of violence. We are also investing in strengthening the so-called patrols and Maria da Penha rounds. We have already allocated resources to expand these kinds of patrols. The aim is that after 4 years' time, at least 50% of all municipalities will have this service in their own localities. In August 2019, together with the Justice Ministry and Public Safety, we launched the Covenant for the Implementation of Preventive Public Policies and the fight of violence against women. And this is a cross-cutting situation. So all ministries are now fighting violence against women. This covenant has already brought excellent results. And here I wish to tell you that homicides in Brazil have fallen 22%, and rape has also dropped 19% in Brazil. There are so many challenges that we're facing, but we here express our commitment to always continue to fight violence against women and any kind of prejudice. And thus, the big challenges that we have in Brazil are manifold. And right now, we have a new reality. And I'd like to mention that the reality of the Venezuelan women who come to our country. In the last 2 years, we have received more than 430,000 Venezuelan women in the migration process that is taking place in all of our countries. And of these, many women came on their own. And Brazil is receiving these women, and that's another additional challenge for our country. The migrant woman. That is how Brazil is going forward, receiving all women, working hard so that no woman will be left behind. And I promise we will come back here to ECLEC soon, and we will say that Brazil is indeed the best place in the world to be born a girl. And the country is now getting rid of violence against women.
Muchas gracias, Damares.
Thank you, Damari. It's important because we all want the same. We have different paces, but we all want the same for all of us who are here and for those who are outside. Thank you very much for your words. I will now give the floor to Harold Robinson, Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean of the UNFPA. He has ample experience in management of international organizations and cooperation systems. He has had many years' experience in the development of UN systems, including UN Program for Development and Population Fund. He has also worked with other organizations in international projects. Before being appointed in this current position, he was resident coordinator at UN, and he was representative for UNDP in Panama since December of 2016, and he was also the head of the post-2015 agenda of the Population Fund in New York. He graduated from California University. Mr. Robinson has a master's degree in economy, focusing human resources. You have the floor, Mr. Harrow. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm very thankful for ECLEC and UN Women for the invitation to be here and participate in this very important panel. Let me start out by talking about Beijing and Cairo's relationship. These are interdependent and they are mutually reinforcing, as we all know. Last year, at 20 years of Cairo, Nairobi summit was held. There, many countries throughout the world committed themselves to speed up meeting Cairo's declaration. This was a very important moment where celebration was at hand, but we realized that there were many things to celebrate, but many things that had not been accomplished. That was the last time when all members, civil society, and the states got together to make sure that in 10 years' time we would sit down to celebrate that all of Cairo's articles would be met. And there are 207 commitments between all of the countries and civil societies that are struggling to truly meet that agenda. Much has been accomplished, yes, and they are well read in the reports, but we must also admit that we still have to reduce structural inequalities, especially those that are girls and women face, indigenous, Afro-descendants, women with disabilities, special needs, as well as adolescents. These are the ones that have the worst indicators in terms of sexual and reproductive education and exclusion, as well as maternal mortality, access to contraceptives, and violence. It's important to say that there are problems that have not been mentioned when Cairo and Beijing met, and that was children's marriage. And this is one of the most important parts of the reivindication of women's and girls' rights. And why? Because they're also related with poverty, intergenerational poverty, and the deficit in the full exercise of women to live a life devoid of violence. Making all of this more visible right now is crucial in order to have a true response to ensure these rights to girls and women. But it's important also to go back to some of the topics that are still pending in this agenda. 25 years afterwards, in such an unequal region, and that only affects, though, a few groups. So in following that plan from UNFP, let me remind you that one of the main goals is to leave not to permit any woman to die in giving birth. It doesn't sound like rocket science, right? We went to the moon 50 years ago, and so this is past history. And what we want is to ensure that every single woman will survive giving birth. And we know that the women who die giving birth are living in certain places and are in certain conditions. And this is something that was promised 25 years ago, and that is still not met, not fully met.
Mujeres tengan los
And also, women should have the means to put their productive decisions into practice, to be empowered not only to make the decisions, but to have the means to carry them out. And so, access to contraceptives. At these meetings, women pay for contraceptives, and those women who have no money often are unable to put their right into practice. So that has to change. We want to eradicate gender violence, including sexual violence, and putting an end to femicide and harmful practices and child marriages, forced marriages. And now the continuous femicides and high levels of impunity and the reports and mobilizations. Women show that, unfortunately, Latin America and the Caribbean is a region that is very unsafe for women and girls. The data show that while other regions move ahead in reducing child marriages, in our region we're the same today as we were 25 years ago. This affects 1 in 4 girls. Most of these girls have children before the age of 18, and this cannot continue. And now for decision makers, and the UNFPA has moved ahead in terms of costing. What would it mean in terms of costs for all women to enjoy their reproductive rights and that may comply with these or meet these 3 goals? The cost is $254 billion, which is equal to 45 combat planes. So this is an important data because this is just a matter of political will and public priorities regarding the rights of women and girls. So prevention of child marriage costs about $600 per girl. And that, of course, is something that our governments could cover. I think it is important to see that we are facing challenges in the region, despite we need to celebrate the meeting of the agenda. And the first is the economic slowdown in the region and the contraction of public spending. We know that this will have 2 impacts. One, the possibility of reducing social expenditure, and of course the resources assigned to this agenda. And the other important thing is whether there is reduction in the resources given to women and the households, because they often pay for their own contraceptives. And it could be that this reduces that use. And they say the calculation of 63.7% of women will be unable to pay for contraceptives. The other threat is a threat against human rights and the advancements of positions that intend to restrict the rights and autonomy of girls, young people, and women, reproductive rights, and especially among the most discriminated groups, indigenous groups, Afro-descendants, LGBTI. And so I would like to recognize the energetic work of these groups that continue to promote and defend the rights of these groups. Our countries are homogeneous and diverse, but we are sane. Mentioning some main areas of work that are important. We should continue in order to achieve these goals. The first is focus on the territory, going to the countries and find those groups that are lagging behind, go to the communities, make an effort to change social and gender rules and norms that promote early marriages, adolescent pregnancies. And also we should question short-term approaches and look in demographic and economic analysis with a gender perspective. Look for an answer to to long-term policies that will allow us to achieve that qualitative advancement that we need. And of course, in the Population Fund, we are supporting these efforts. I've already told you about the study that we did on the cost of contraceptives. And we will also have a methodology that we've developed for finance ministries to know the cost of adolescent pregnancy, the cost that this implies for the adolescent, what it implies for society, what it implies for the country. And because this must become a priority for multidimensional public policy priority. And we must make the most of the demographic bonus. As reminded today by Rebecca Greenspan here, the region in general is at the end of its demographic bonus. Some countries will continue a little longer, but it is important to recognize that we must invest in young people, and especially girls, to make sure that we're making the most of the last breath of that demographic bonus. And also we must work in partnerships. As reminded by Maria Noel, working together with UN Women, we in the Population Fund must ensure the agenda be met. I think those of us in this business know that there is no Cairo without Beijing, and there is no Beijing without Cairo. We know that we must continue to work to make sure that these targets, commitments taken on 25 years ago, may be met. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Harold. Very relevant work. And now we're going to be addressed by Rebecca Greenspan, Secretary General of the Iberian American General Secretariat. She's been the joint Secretary General of the UN and Associate Administrator of the UN Program for Development. Second, President of Costa Rica during the administration of Figes. Olson, Secretary General of the Ibero-American General Secretariat in 2014, meted at the extraordinary meeting of Foreign Affairs held on February 2014 in Mexico, and where representatives of 22 countries were present, part of the Ibero-American Conference. Rebecca, the floor is yours. 1,000 thanks. It is a pleasure to be here. This is a luxury panel and forum surrounded by so many friends. And we've heard, I think, today very interesting proposals. So I will try and avoid repeating a lot of what has been said already, and will most especially refer to economic empowerment of women, the work that we've been doing with UN Women, but not without first congratulating ECLAC and UN Women for the work done and for throughout this time in order to achieve gender equality in our countries. But before getting in directly to the theme, the specific theme that I will be talking about, I would like to emphasize two things with regard to what we've done here today. The first is that the report begins by recognizing the progress made by the region and the major effort made to pass many laws promoting a legal framework, mechanisms for women for substantive equality, and throughout this time, in terms of violence, in terms of typifying femicide, it is so sad. In more than a dozen countries, we have this figure of the femicide because murder was insufficient to describe what was actually going on. But nevertheless, we've seen a conceptualization of the theme in the region. And this is relevant, and we've ratified many international conventions and so on. But what I do want to say is that it is important to begin by recognizing progress, because I think that defeatism is the greatest demobilizer and the greatest barrier to the transformation of society. When we believe reality cannot be changed, then we do nothing. And so therefore, here, now, the second thing is recognizing that all of this that has happened has been the result of a collective movement, the feminist movement, and that is why we are here today, all of us, whom we must thank, all of these women here who have maintained this struggle from different trenches to achieve these gains in society, because this is not a solitary struggle. This is a collective struggle. Joining efforts to do this is one of the most important things that we must celebrate here today at this conference. And throughout this history, the struggle and the legislative field has been very relevant. And probably in terms of equal political participation is where we've made greatest progress. Precisely, as Nadine was saying today over breakfast this morning, that the critical mass achieved in parliamentary level has been very important, and it is our promotion of these critical masses in order to reform laws means that this is one of the most important things in terms of gains. And as pointed out by a dear feminist leader from Mexico, Marcelo Lagarde, Marcela used to say, the gender advances and is empowered when women take part, when they occupy the institutions, and in doing so transform the space, the norms, and the political culture. And probably that is the path we will have to follow throughout this time. And so, with regard to empowering, economic empowering of women, we have been working with UN Women to try and determine which of those laws and rules that still obstacle the economic empowerment of women. Before getting into each one in detail and the report that we presented this morning, I would like also to contribute a different narrative in terms of economic empowerment of women. with regard to the global situation of economies and that our countries are going through. Because, as Alicia well said yesterday, we're in a process of economic slowdown worldwide, and our region is suffering this slowdown process. But when we ask, what are the measures that we need in order to speed up economic growth, to regain more inclusive and sustainable growth in the region, we should be able to provide those elements to reaffirm ourselves, but that, well, is still not part of what is said by the ministries of finance in our countries. And one of the most important measures in order to recover inclusive and sustainable growth in the region is to expand the economic participation, engagement of women. I'm not just saying employment. I'm here talking about labor, work, not only employment, but the active participation of women in the economy. And for that, we need to change the narrative of what happened in the first few years of the century when we grew very fast, when we reduced poverty and reduced inequality in Latin America. Because what have we heard when we learned of what happened in the first decade and a half of the 21st century? We heard that we grew because there were very good prices for raw materials. We are told that we grew because there were social policies that were active in our region. And there was mention of several of the social programs that happened at the time. But what is mentioned not so often, less often mentioned, is what happened in the labor market. What happened in the labor market. And what happened there is that women increased their active engagement in the labor market. And that was one of the most relevant aspects of this speedy growth that we experienced during that decade. And that happened at the same time that minimum wages went up in most of the countries of the region. And that is why the minimum wage instrument and labor participation becomes what we have most at hand in order to increase growth in our countries, because it's that growth at the start of the decade was not on account of increased productivity, was on account expanded inclusion of the economic possibilities of broad sectors of the population, and the women played a very fundamental role there. But that is not reflected so clearly in the economic analyses that we read, and that explain why we had an inclusive and speedy growth in the first part of the century. We need to recover that narrative, recover it to say that in this slowdown, where once again we're seeing a setback in poverty and equity, and the economic engagement of women, the way of turning it around is to have policies specifically targeted to recover women's participation in the labor market and giving them economic opportunities. That would be the closest way that ministries, finance ministries have to recover the pathway of greater inclusion and growth and sustainability. But it's not always mentioned in the analysis, the relevance of this aspect in all the good results that everyone celebrates in the first decade and a half this century. And that is why we too have especially focused on economic empowerment of women and the obstacles, the barriers that we still face, those barriers in laws that need to be removed and overcome to continue strengthening the economic empowerment of women. An example of this, although we are still specifying the situation country by country, But we say we need to do away with laws that need to be eradicated and others reformed. And I would like to say that what we have found is that there are at least 2 discriminatory laws by country that must be reformed. 8 areas that I will only mention, because I don't have time to get into them, and where we've done this analysis. There are many others where the situation should be analyzed, but well, we chose these 7 together with UN Women. Gender equality, non-discrimination in constitutional frameworks and family law. The freedom of choice of employment. There are some choices still that are banned in certain countries for women. Let me say that some of these banned professions, it's not that they were dying to work in them, like mining, for example, but this does reflect a sort of patronism against women that we must combat. And third, wage equality. It's not just equal pay for equal work, but equal pay for equal value of work. Fourth, protection of maternity, of course, and financing for that. 5, leave for paternity. It is regrettable that the greatest leave for maternity in the region is 8 days for men. 6, social security. And here I'd like to mention the reforms that are on the way in terms of social security and that are going to affect equity. And once again, same as Luis this morning, I would like to emphasize the Iberian Convention on Social Security. Magnolia Briaño is here, the Secretary General of the OIS, and that is the only international convention that recognizes the contributions made by workers in different countries for the accumulation of their contributions may allow them a pension and the portability of those pensions regardless of where they've worked, because the discrimination and the greatest injustice is that we have so many men and women that have worked in different countries, paid in different countries, and in none of them, despite their effort and work, can they obtain a pension, because in no of them do they have the necessary density of payments if they do not add them all up. 15 Iberian American countries have already ratified the convention, 11 are already implemented, but we are 22 countries, and when we have 22 countries under the convention, we will have justice for workers, migrant workers in our region.
Number 7, naturally, care. And number 8, household paid work and the 189 convention from ILO, as well as different ILO agreements such as labor harassment that was only ratified, I think, by Uruguay. That was the first country in the world to ratify it. These are examples in these 8 fields of legislation that either must be deleted or reformed. And then we have all the non-existing laws. The question, which are the ones that don't exist? Which are the ones that will lead us to the next stage in empowering women from an economic standpoint? I'd like to mention 3 of these because I don't have enough time. Number 1, we already noticed important legislation in our countries trying to set up different kinds of companies with other objectives and not just maximizing yield. Other things such as environmental sustainability and gender equality. These companies are already gaining incentives so that these new means of economic participation may be stronger and more extensive. We must be there. A company doing things differently is precisely involved in equity and inclusion within these companies in order to be able to reach anything similar to what is called triple impact companies, the B companies, B corporations. There are many, many names involved, but we still do not have strong action by ourselves so that no single company will be devoid of these principles. A second very important topic into the future has to do with public procurement. It was mentioned here today. If the states were to legislate so that public procurement gave priority to the companies that have a certain kind of behavior in terms of our goals, then we would have much greater impact in empowering women. Gabriela today talked about the impact funds that are already including gender as a standard to decide on where to invest. And the third one has to do with the future in the labor market. What's going to be this new world like? And in this new world, we must get the laws or the system that will face the new world in terms of labor will have two basic elements involved. First, Social Security should not depend on the type of work the person has, but only the work that is performed. The type of work is what most discriminates women in both in informal and formal sectors in our company. We must protect the workers, not the job. And if we don't change this, we will not reach this more fair world that we are striving for. We must adapt our educational systems, our training systems, so that we may indeed have better quality jobs, more stable jobs, and thus face the technological world. And I repeat, I'm not afraid of a world without employment because of technological transformation. I am much more afraid of this unequal world. The demand for labor will always exist. The question is, will we be able to satisfy that with quality jobs, with social protection as we all deserve? We there must be at the forefront of the struggle. Women who have also been the first line of resistance when the world wanted to go back in many of our accomplishments. We can't just resist. We must also have a proposal going forward. We must preview what's going to happen, and thus we can do that only through the joining and using up this energy that we're facing in our countries, looking not only into the past, but also into the future. I wrap up now quoting something that should be remembered by all of us. We need laws that will reflect society we are trying to build, not the one we're trying to leave behind. There's still a long way to go so that may come to fruition. Thank you, Rebecca. What a great challenge thinking about the past, the present, and the future. We now give the floor to Sharon Kobun Robinson, Director of Gender Ministry from Jamaica. Sharon has an important role in the implementation of national policy for gender equality, as well as the coordination of the qualitative dimensions of social policy and research towards action. Her experience in gender studies and development has a strong impact in her job in implementing the strategic national plan to eliminate gender violence in Jamaica. As a focal point for the gender division, she represents the ministry through the participation in different fora in order to ensure the perfect integration of gender into plans, programs, projects, and national plans. As a transforming, enabling leader, she involves key players through strategic alliances and cooperation in order to reach this gender equality and empowering women according to the mandate to include the gender perspective at the ministry. Thank you, Sharon, for being here. You have the floor.
It is really a pleasure to be here because I'm representing the Caribbean region, which is very, very broad in terms of the number of countries, but I'm also very happy because 25 years ago, when Jamaica was a part of Beijing, that Beijing conference in Beijing, China, the delegation was not just government. The delegation comprised government and NGOs, some of whom are here with us. They have been a part of the fight, and the conversation has continued from that point to now, where the government understands the importance of working in partnership with the NGOs. I do have with me some of the delegation, members of the delegation from the Caribbean who are here, NGOs and government, coming here because this is so very important. So this year, 2020, is extremely pivotal for the accelerated realization of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls, as for us, it marks the decade of action. The global community marks the 25th anniversary of the 4th World Conference, and it is also significant because the SDGs, of which we have signed on to with those 17 goals, also push us to ensure that the milestones will serve as a platform for robust conversation and affirmation, getting our actions done in such a way that the gains that we've made are irreversible and that we measure the progress as we move forward to achieving that gender equality and women's empowerment agenda. We're aware that the platform covers 12 critical areas of concern, and each area we consider as extremely critical in the Caribbean region, because all of them would allow us to have a particular space and a voice to which, as a platform from which we speak. So poverty, for example, I just list them very quickly. Poverty, education and training, health, violence, armed conflict, economy, power and decision making, institutional mechanisms, human rights, media, environment, the girl child. We were asked to prioritize from this list of critical areas and from the whole gamut of actions that we consider important, the main priorities for us. I can speak for Jamaica's top 5. Now it's difficult, it was very difficult to get our top 5 because we actually had top 10. But I will drill down to the top 5. The top 5 is, the first one is eliminating violence against women and girls. Now, I'm sure you're aware that in terms of violence against women and girls, it is a huge issue for us, where almost every day we have women facing issues of violence. Just recently, we've had more cases of murder-suicide, where a partner would kill his spouse or common law partner. Sometimes it's a long-term relationship, children are involved, and this person would take down the lives of this person, and in some cases take his or her own life. In most cases, it's male violence to female, but in some cases, it's female to female and male to male. The second priority area we listed was equality and non-discrimination under the law and access to justice. This is a huge issue for Jamaica and all the Caribbean countries, because inequality is a big issue where there are some very, very structural issues that cause inequality and cause persons to not be able to benefit from issues, from activities, from provision services that they should be accessing because inequality is rife and is in some cases structural. The third priority we listed was institutional mechanisms for the advancement of gender equality. And here I want to mention the national machinery. Over the years, we've had reports and comments coming back from the Beijing and from Beijing reports we've sent every 4 years, as well as our CEDAW reports that we've sent, to indicate that the national machinery needs to be significantly strengthened. I must say here, we would not have been able to come here and speak unless we had the support of our NGOs, we have the support of our private sector, civil society, and we have the support from our IDBs, International Development Partners, UN Women, ECLA. We have the high commissions, and that is a lot of work that we do is partnership and collaboration with these groups. We have the fourth listed as women in power and decision making. We consider this very critical because our statistics indicate that at this point, we only have 19% of the females in politics are 19%, meaning the rest of the men, the rest of the lower house would be men, 81%. Even though we have a national policy for gender equality which states that our minimum quota is 30%, at this point it is 19%. There's 18% of cabinet ministers, and the chair and the chair of state boards is 15%, a mere 15%, meaning 75% of the chair of state boards are men. And so that tells us that we have significant work to do in that area. Women empowerment decision making is a very critical area in Beijing in terms of pushing to make sure. So we have been asking for and have received support from our IDBs and other partners to help us with training. The women's groups have also done a significant amount of work training women who are able to run for political representation, and have done successfully based on the training that they have received, even despite that there are lots of challenges, and so we continue to work with them. The fifth area that we identified is women's entrepreneurship, which is very grave, and women's enterprises. Now, women's entrepreneurship is a big issue for us because entrepreneurship allows women to have autonomy and independence, and in most cases, acquire wealth. And so if there's an issue with entrepreneurship, it means that we are going to have dependencies and women will not have autonomy. And sometimes that results in gender-based violence and other types of financial abuse and so on. So what have we done? Based on the breakout I got for this panel, I was asked to look at the main areas, looked at challenges, what we have done, and so on. So I will quickly give you just a few. There are quite a few, but I'll just give you a few. In terms of the equality and non-discrimination under the law and access to justice, we have discovered that review of legislation, writing new pieces of legislation, lobbying for legislation to be passed, and not just passed, but implemented, is very critical. And so the Domestic Violence Act, which is so very important, because that speaks to how do you protect persons who are victims of violence and to ensure that there is redress for victims. We have had a review of that piece of legislation along with 3 other pieces. That's the Sexual Offences Act, the Offences Against the Person Act, and the Child Care Protection Act. We are awaiting those bits of legislation to be assented so that we can actually have these new pieces of redress. The whole idea of having the review is to facilitate the strengthening of existing provisions, because we recognize that the provisions were weak, the penalties were lame, basically in some cases a slap on the wrist, and given our contextual reality with such a violent culture, we recognize that we needed to have these revisions done. Now, these are not the only pieces of legislation that need to be revised, but those are the ones that were revised, and so we continue to push with the support of our NGO partners and private sector partners to have other pieces of legislation revised and new pieces of legislation written to match our contextual reality. Today, we have the Joint Select Committee of Parliament meeting simultaneously as I'm here with the Minister of Gender Affairs leading on that committee. It's a Joint Select Committee of Parliament that is looking at the Sexual Harassment Prevention Act. And that piece of legislation has been on the books for many, many years, and we are still not happy that it still has not been approved. It has gone through at the lower house, but it is now at the Senate being debated. And so we anxiously wait breathlessly to see that legislation come to light, because we do have lots of issues where that is concerned. Another area is looking at program and programmatic interventions to support victims of violence and to ensure that vulnerabilities are reduced. So we're looking at types of persons who are vulnerable, including children. If we continue to look at the violence issue, we are happy to announce that we got support through UN Women and the Development Bank to have a women's health survey. And so for the very first time, we do have data that is accurate and relevant, and no longer just using anecdotal data, which we had to rely on. Now, this Women's Health Survey gave us really a sort of pulling us up, and like a knee-jerk reaction, because what it did was to tell us that we perhaps did not know that the violence was as bad. Because what happened is they actually spoke to the women who were victims, and they were able to share their lived experiences and share their stories. So we now know what the situation is, and we've been using that to develop legislation and to develop policies and develop programs. We just launched 2 years ago in 2017, 3 years now, our National Plan of Action to eliminate gender-based violence. And that National Strategic Plan has 5 strategic priority areas. It is supposed to be a comprehensive plan that looks at how can we make sure that when a person is violated, that there's a comprehensive structure to follow up. And before that, how can we prevent violence so that persons who are not victims do not become victims? The plan is predicated on 5 strategic priority areas, and it subscribes to the due diligence framework. The first is prevention. The second is protection. The third is looking at how do we protect the victim to ensure that there is redress. So if it is the person who wants to take out a protection order, how do we make sure that the protection order is able to do what it should? And if it is violated, what are the penalties? So one of the things that happened under the Domestic Violence Act review is that we looked at how can we ensure that the protection order that is taken out by a female or a male, in most cases a female, who has been violated, how do we make sure that the enforcement takes place? We have looked also at strategies for shelter protection. How do we make sure that once a person is in need of protection, is being violated, being harmed, and there's a toxic environment, the person needs to leave, how do we make sure that that happens? And for the very first time in our budget since 1974, when the Bureau was established, we got a significant injection of funds to allow us to purchase a state-run shelter, which we did last year, and to purchase 2 more shelters this year, to renovate the one we purchased, and to ensure that we have at least 3 regional shelters that will allow for victim protection to go across the island. Now, this is something we have done with, over the years, NGOs. So for years we have worked through a public-private partnership agreement with Women Inc. But we recognize that based on the volume of the cases that we get, we will need to have a broader and more comprehensive type of treatment. And that is the reason we have allowed for and perhaps requested that there is greater support for women. We have done MOUs as well with different ministries, departments, and agencies to allow us to support women in terms of entrepreneurship. We have looked also at trying to make sure that our social protection strategy is robust and responsive. We've looked at gender and climate change. We have worked with a number of groups to ensure that the social protection is broadened. We've looked at our workers who are very vulnerable, including our domestic workers. And so we have signed on to C-189, which is that Convention on Decent Work. And at this point, we are aggressively pursuing the ratification of C-190, which speaks to sexual harassment for sexual harassment relating to household workers because of the fact that they are in such a vulnerable space, working in a space where, in most cases, nobody sees this act of sexual harassment, and sometimes it is just like their word against the person who is the violator. What are the challenges? The challenges are many. Pervasive socio-cultural norms and harmful gender stereotypes, which stymie the progress that we need. Absence of sustained and rigorous collection of sex-aggregated data to inform social policy development, programs and actions, and for the seamless implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. Lack of a holistic perspective to facilitate the analysis of root causes of gender inequality within the context of women and men having their spaces violated in many cases. How do we get buy-in for implementation strategies that will focus on healthy gender relations between the sexes and eliminate the monster of violence once and for all? Lack of ongoing gender analysis for all the plans and actions that assess the differential impact of proposed policy and interventions at different levels. Finally, I want to suggest that for this, I was asked, how do we tie in this gender equality, next generation equality forum with the Beijing Declaration for Platform of Action? My recommendation is that it can facilitate certainly a recognition of the nature of the inequality, which is often systemic and structural, and that we must recognize that gender is not a woman's issue, but a relational issue. Women and men have different and special needs and therefore cannot be treated as homogeneous. Women tend to be disadvantaged relative to men. Gender differences can also result in men and boys being disadvantaged. So we need to challenge, certainly, the sociocultural and sociopolitical barriers and identify practical strategies for targeted interventions. Encourage and enable the participation of all relevant parties, beneficiaries, and key stakeholders to assess the gender differential impact. Provide training and leadership at all levels for buy-in, sustainability, and continuity. highlight the value of local knowledge, especially among youth and millennials as valued holders of local knowledge forms, promote the preservation and knowledge, valuing traditional knowledge and new technologies, improve the ownership of land and cultural assets, and the protection of international and intellectual property rights, create non-restrictive aid framework, prioritize gender-responsive budgeting and planning. In concluding, I wish to reiterate our commitment to the gender equality agenda as a youthful and reformed feminist agenda. This new initiative will be extremely successful to the extent that it will bring together a range of stakeholders to collaborate on the design of a plethora of initiatives to provide fresh impetus and passion for the next 25 years and beyond.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Sharon. It's very important to recall our commitment to the agenda. And now we will close with the last presentation of the panel with our dear Alicia Bárcena, whom yesterday gave us a very good introductory presentation. Let's see how inspired she is today. Well, she's always inspired, yes. But as you well know, Alicia took on as the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean of the UN, ECLAC, on June the 1st, 2008. And she was appointed by the Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Ban Ki-moon at the time, and so became the first woman to hold this position. And not the last, yes. Not the last. That's important. Very well. As such, she has led the work of the organization as a center of excellence and applied research to public policy on sustainable development, the forum of regional dialogue, intergovernment dialogue, and multi-sectoral dialogue on sustainable development and provider of technical cooperation to countries. Alicia, the floor is yours. Thank you, and truly it is a pleasure to be part of this panel. I would like to recognize, without a doubt, that at 43 years of the regional conference, 25 since Beijing, 5 since the 2030 agenda, there's been progress. There are gaps that have been analyzed in the panel and concrete proposals to move ahead with the economic inclusion of women. But I would like to address another topic, and that is, what is it that this region is trying to tell the world? That is, we must address, without any doubt, the challenge of Latin America and the Caribbean, of course, in relation to the global world and global negotiation, because we're still living in a world divided by two Weberian types that Brevis mentioned, the center and the periphery. And the truth is that we have a great challenge to be included far more and converge between the periphery and the center. But we're still far from that. And I believe that we must take in very important asymmetries as women, because it's this forum of women that must have the vision of the future. With that generation of light, these demonstration that the generation of the light aged 15 to 25, because, excuse me, because I'm triennial or whatever, but millennials are more or less focused on a comfort area, but not the younger people. These young people aged 15 to 25 are impatient because we're not at a time of change. We're in a change in era. And we're in the interregnum of Gramsci, that the exhausted world, the wild neoliberalism, depleted, yes, the prevalence of the market, they have been depleted. And I'm not saying it. It's not only me. I've just arrived from the Davos Economic Forum where all panels spoke of this. Yes, these were the multimillionaires speaking about the multimillionaires, but somehow they are understanding, the millionaires and the billionaires, that the capitalist world, the wild world, is over. And so we're in this interregnum. between what's new and what is not yet there. This past, like an elephant that never wants to leave, so to speak, and this depleted model with the last freaks and we're trying to push out and doesn't want to go, and we're in this very complex interregnum, and that's why young people are impatient, because they say, look, hurry up, because we don't have that much time. Because it happens that, look, take a look at the data that I would like to share with you. We have some asymmetries that are violent at global level. We have spoken of inequality in Latin America, but just a moment, let me tell you about the inequality at global level. 1%, the wealthiest 1% is wealthier than 4.6 billion people, 60% of the planet. 22 wealthiest men in the world have more money than all the women in Africa. And so worldwide, we have 12.5 billion hours of unpaid work with a value that is truly of $10.8 billion at least. And this was said over there at the forum in Davos, of course, in small panels. Of course, it didn't come out in the press and all that. But that is the truth. This is reality. This is inequality. And so what can we say in this region to them? Well, first of all, that this region, and I hope this is the case, we're looking for a new development paradigm. We're looking for a new world and a new model, a different way of creating wealth. And why a different way? Well, because we want to take responsibility, because today we cannot re-primarization and extractivism. We must move towards different ways of doing it, where renewable energy, water, and I think it is we women, I'm sorry to have to say this here, the divine men, they're lovely, but they are fearful of this. We women are a bit more going for it, and we must truly move toward this new way of growing, of living, of looking for well-being, because environmental destruction, my dears, is far more aggressive and fast than we thought originally. And the truth is, the center periphery is an issue, because it happens that the center is generating 14 tons of greenhouse gases, and the periphery not even 4. So please, why in our region we must fight for adaptation? Mitigation must be over there. It's the center that must take responsibility for that. We must address adaptation, and that is what I have been fighting for, COP 1 to 25, and we're going for the 26th, and we still have no solution for adaptation, to care for biodiversity, to connect the tissue of the earth and the diversity that indigenous people have talked to us so much about, and they say biodiversity is at risk, and they're quite right. Because we don't have much time, because 75% of the territory of Latin America and the Caribbean is disturbed, and 66% of the oceans. We've touched the 9 planetary limits, and who realizes this more than anyone else? Women. The women who are in the fields, in the land, in the earth. They that are realizing that, well, women, especially those who deal with nature, that observe it, understand it, and read it. Yes, because nature is saying several things. Nature is saying, look, girls and boys, with you or without you, the planet will continue. I'm sorry to tell you, number one. Number two, it's saying that the greatest resilience that we could hope for is diversity, biological diversity, cultural diversity, human diversity, and that is the great transition that we're into. I know that we sometimes resist this sexual diversity, biological diversity, because we're frightened, yes, but we need it. We need it urgently. It is the only way that we will be able to move toward a new world, to truly learn and have, I would say, that well-being that we're after. So my big question here is, what does this regional conference on women want to say to the rest of the world? Well, we must at least say to the world 3 things. To begin with, we want multilateralism that strengthens democracy. But what does that mean? Because these words, democracy, have been bandied about, and they cannot be democracy, for example, when social demonstrators are asked to ask permission to be mobilized. No, 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 it's not a matter of permission. Excuse me, no, no. Mobilization, demonstration is the change, and what we need is to promote the interests of the many over the benefits concentrated in just a few. That is essential. This conference must defend the interests of the majority over and above the interests of the few. And that is what we've been talking about since yesterday and today. Concentration, exclusion. And second, we must defend the rights of groups that have no voice, the most vulnerable, those who do not attend these forums, that we must struggle. Marta, compañeras, colleagues, that the multilateral forum, the voices of Latin America and the Caribbean should be heard, yes. Because what happens in the Forum of Indigenous People, well, with a lot of work we've been able to get there with a word or two, but we must take part in all multilateral fora, commercial, economic, social, and lastly, we must strengthen the capacity for discussion of the society, to be transparent, open, for it not to be captured, this social discussion, by power groups. It is very important. The only way that we will evolve on this land, in this society, is if we are able to understand that society requires changes today, urgent changes. It is true we will have to close many gaps, and that's what we're doing, and the ministers here are very busy closing gaps. But this conference must send a clear message, a strong message. Latin America and the Caribbean wants to have a place. We don't want to be treated as middle-income countries that need nothing else and be ignored. No, that is not the case. What we want is a place on the table in the in the Security Council, where we're represented by the Caribbean, yes, and Mexico will also be part. We must be at those political fora. First order, with the voice of women. That is my message. Thank you very much.
Bueno, gracias, Alicia.
Well, thank you, Alicia. You were inspired. You see, very good, Alicia. Yes, you were inspired. The words came out to encourage us for the agreement of Friday and what's to come. Secretary, please. Thank you, Madam Chair. Since we're going to hear all voices, we would like now to invite the representatives of the Regional Consultation of Youth in Latin America and the Caribbean towards Beijing +25, and who will bring their declaration that they've been working on over the weekend. Please.
Hola.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lucas Núñez Saavedra. I'm part of the circle of students living with HIV here in Chile. I'm non-binary, and before reading this, I would like to say 2 things. First, we must not forget that as young people, it is the secondary students that began this transformation that Chile is living today. And never forget that vertical transmission of HIV has not been eradicated fully in several countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. And so therefore it is urgent to think not only in prevention, but on the people who today live with HIV. So we must do away with this thought that we are the subjects of charity. No, we are the subjects of full rights. Thank you. the Declaration of Feminist Youth in Latin America and the Caribbean. 64 women, girls, adolescents, and young people, activists in 24 countries, representative of young people, feminists, Afro-descendants, indigenous people with disability, migrants, refugees, lesbians, bisexuals, trans-nominal and other identities, sexual workers with HIV, non-rural people, peasant people, urban people, vulnerable and non-vulnerable, violent people in Latin America and the Caribbean, meeting in Santiago de Chile from the 25th to 28th of January 2020 within the framework of the Regional Youth Consultation of the Platform for Action for Beijing, plus 25 are here to make our voices heard. We are addressing the states, international agencies, civil society, academics, and the private sector so that our demands be taken into account and that they should commit to materialize our human rights in access to quality education, lay, free of charge, and intercultural at all levels. Free exercising our sexuality with physical freedom. And free of discrimination, political participation, respect for the land, territory, and natural resources of indigenous people, non-criminalization of people who are defending human rights, labor rights, and access to integral quality health care, free of charge with an intercultural approach, putting special attention to mental health with recognizing our ability for agency and freedom, and recognizing our particularities. 25 years since Beijing, the global context has changed and the problems have become more complex. The outburst of the climate change and the digital revolution, which spreads exponentially, changes the living totally at regional level and the ways that we relate between ourselves and the planet, stemming new concerns and helping us to evolve as a community. In relation to gender violence, we see the lack of the gender perspective and interculturality of the institutions responsible for providing justice, and this results in the re-victimization of institutional violence that hinders access to rights, especially among girls, people of different sexual tendencies, Afro-descendants and indigenous people, as well as the lack of absence and protocol of laws and protocols to deconstruct the social and cultural mandates and so ensure a decent life for girls and young people. Sexual violence experienced by girls, young people, and women in the region with high levels of femicide, and that has an impact even more on migrants and refugees, and also gender violence is increased on account of this. In terms of the economy, gender issues, race, class, all converge to increase poverty. There's a tremendous wage gap between men and women. Discrimination that prevent access or development in leadership or managerial positions, lack of public policy, care networks to enhance the labor development of those who carry out care activities and unpaid activities. All of this affects even more young people, indigenous people, Afro-descendants, migrants, refugees, lesbians, bisexuals, trans, travestis, non-binary people with disabilities, among others. We, the youth, have been displaced and precarious in terms of labor employment policies, nor do we have the help at home preventing our labor, social, and family development and have no social security. We condemn extractivism and we propose a production model that also considers women, adolescents, and girls who are living in the most critical areas. And lastly, there's a series of unpaid work or unrecognized work obliging women to live in an even more precarious manner. In relation to sexual and reproductive rights, most countries in our region do not have sexual education, integral education, and if it does exist, it is deficient in how it addresses childhood, adolescence, and human rights, and from a viewpoint that is not only reproductive. Young people, especially those belonging to the historically vulnerable groups, are even experience even more violence because they have no good quality education, no proper health care, and the criminalization of abortion, it goes against the physical autonomy of girls and women. perpetuation of marriage and early marriage and forced marriage, as well as adolescent pregnancy and forced child pregnancies, are a form of violence that goes against our full development in society. These circumstances are especially compromised with the boom of conservative movements, anti-rights, that do not only slow development, but intend to set back rights that have already been gained. As youth, we will not take any step back in our autonomy.
Hola, hola a todos.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mirta. I'm 19. I'm from Bolivia, and I consider I am an activist for human rights, and I'm a feminist. I will continue reading the declaration.
Climática.
In climate justice, we are concerned about the participation of women and young people in decision-making. This makes even worse the lack of implementation of laws and green projects towards sustainability of our planet. We also notice the scarce training of teachers in the environment, in circular economy and the bee system, especially in vulnerable areas, indigenous territories that have and places that have been affected by climate change. As to participation leadership, a big obstacle we encounter is that in some countries in the region, there is still no gender parity in political, public, and social positions. We don't have any posts that are set aside for LGBT, indigenous, Afro-descendants, people with disabilities, and women belonging to vulnerable groups. And to add to this, the political participation of young girls and women in decision-making positions is practically nil. Discrimination limits the representation of these groups and minority sectors. In other places, the penalization of the right to march makes it difficult for girls and young women to participate in political spheres. We still need more participation of young girls and women in all fields of knowledge, especially in technology, innovation, and science, technology, engineering, and math. We also need more state measures to promote scientific and technological education, public education, so as to eliminate the sexist education in these places. We should ensure universal access to free, quality, feminist education with interculture, feminist, dissident kind of education, both in formal and informal places. On the other hand, illiteracy in our region is still one of the main barriers in reducing poverty, where young girls and women have no good quality education because they're devoted to household and unpaid jobs. In view of this, Latin American Caribbean youth identify as priority challenges to recognize, encourage different ways of looking at a comprehensive human rights system with a different articulation that will permit diversity with equity. Common action should be adopted by state, NGOs, and civil society so as to have more development in a cross-cutting way, in a sustainable way, ensuring the protection of those that defend our natural resources and the environment. We urge states to monitor and to deliver the necessary budget and implement public policies addressing youth, implementing all of the agreements that have been subscribed by the countries in gender equality, ensuring economic rights for groups that are usually left aside, getting rid of the wage gaps and recognizing unpaid jobs, the exploitation and job precarious nature, ensuring some kind of income to young mothers, and favoring an inclusive, sustainable, equitable, solidarity system, granting the necessary conditions to ensure our entry into worthy, dignified jobs, both in paid and unpaid jobs, with initiatives that will have a social, economic, and environmental impact as led by Latin American Caribbean youth, ensuring the mainstreaming of participation of women in all diversities, implementing non-discriminatory laws that will protect all our identities, typifying femicides as less body homophobic crimes in our criminal codes, and offering sexual and reproductive services to all as of prevention towards HIV and other infections that will include social family planning, contraceptives, and physical autonomy, ensuring universal access to free quality education with a gender focus that be cross-cutting, dissident, decolonial, and including the education for special needs, stressing comprehensive sexual education with technology innovation, encouraging the participation of women and teachers as well, training health professionals in social and sexual and reproductive education, legalizing and ensuring access to abortion in a free way to all women, tackling the climate crisis with a gender perspective, encouraging action for the care of the environment in a cross-cutting fashion, ratifying and implementing the Escazú agreement in all countries in the region, encouraging the political participation of young women and vulnerable groups through new spaces that will empower and organize citizens in a non-discriminatory fashion, ratifying also the Convention for the Elimination of All Kinds of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, the Convention on the Rights of Children, thus ensuring our future. As to UN system, UN agencies, and international organization, we urge that you recognize the colonizing and adult kind of a system with discourses and diversified practices, supporting civil society in terms of our sexual and reproductive rights, giving political support to projects with local that encourage local democracy, rejecting violence against social leaders, with training processes for incidents in the mechanisms of the UN, especially for youth from real, as in thus encouraging real outcome and not just discourses.
María Jauro Maos Cochere, Guacamín. Mi nombre es María.
I am Maria Florida Meno Pesada, and I come from Guatemala. I am 17 years old and I'm part of the Guatemalan Parliament for Youth for 9 years now. I am now spokesman of young girls and women from indigenous people from Latin America and the Caribbean.
En continuidad de nuestra declaración.
And I will read our declaration. To the private sector, we should promote the respect to principles of human rights in meeting all of the standards that have to do with gender, labor rights, sustainability, and responsibility towards the environment and indigenous people, LGBTI, CU, and with special needs. We also should recognize the policies and regulations that follow human rights, granting funding to the movements of young people, women, and different entities without any kind of discrimination, with autonomy and budget, ensuring the marginal groups to upper positions and good jobs for the full development of those who work in these fields. A responsible management of communication without the reproduction of discrimination against gender and communication campaigns in order to educate the avoidance of gender prejudice, focusing or allocating funds for organizations to have more access to rural peoples, creating policies, job policies, getting rid of the gender discrimination, getting rid of precarious jobs, and granting social security to all women, to the civil society, more participation in decision-making spheres through proposals and initiatives that will represent all that we believe, and following up our public policies as well, that boys, girls, and young people have a voice in their agendas, and they may be able to participate, strengthening base organizations and getting funds to be more available to the academia, that they become a tool for social mobilization with a focus on human rights that will include school planning with a gender, sexuality, diversity focus with scientific basis to ensure the participation research of women that are lesbians, bisexuals, trans, travestis, non-binary, Afro-descendants, migrants, indigenous, HIV positive with disabilities, and from rural areas. As the youth for Latin America and the Caribbean, we promise to mobilize this declaration in our own countries with civil society organizations, providing all of the information that exists on this consultation. We will actively support the collective struggle, respecting diversity as of the union, contention, and different spaces in order to strengthen youth participation in and also at local, national, international levels, striving so that we may end up with concrete, efficient measure to monitor and to follow up everything having to do with public policy, laws, and action plans of our country so as to ensure the rights of young people in our diversities, respecting all agreements signed in regional consultation of youth towards Beijing Plus 25 through reports and future meetings leveraging gender issues as of the creation of networks between women, assessing from now on the progress and new challenges according to what comes up. We are the collective scream of people who struggle for a better world, a more egalitarian world that demands a justice, and of our countries, their attention, commitment, and action for full enjoyment of the rights of youth in all our diversities.
A continuación,
We will now give the floor to the representative from Indigenous Women's Link, and they will read the declaration of the forum that met on Monday. Good morning. I'm Margot Sante, and I'm Quechua from Peru. We insist, we resist, and we push ahead. Beijing is now 25 years old. The Fourth World Conference on Women was not just another conference. We came there with a crude experience and with all previous progress, especially Vienna conference, where for the first time the rights of women were recognized as human rights, and El Cairo as well, where the reproductive rights were set up, were opening up the door for sexual rights. And here we are 25 later, when we still insist in ratifying the Beijing platform as well as CEDAW's agenda, Rio, Vienna, Cairo, and Durban, as well as roadmaps reivindicating the role that we have played, we feminist and women's movement, in the construction of these agendas. And we appeal to states, governments, and different players to join us in recognizing equality as a good, as an asset. Feminist and women's organizations, we wish to show our concern for the political and economic situation of our countries in the world. It's a destroying system based on the extraction of raw material and as well as of paid and unpaid labor. Time, territory, natural resources in our bodies are being robbed. The extraction society is incompatible with life's sustainability. This is seen in social unrest in the region with the presence of feminists and our relationship with all groups that struggle for ethnical, economic, gender equality. Those of us who raise our voices to avoid the merchandising of life, and that is why we resist. We vindicate the right for social protest. This should not be penalized. We reject that. Just by going against mega projects, we are made responsible for the failings in the social economic development. We will not allow for extraction to deplete our territories, which is being done by the patriarchs into our bodies. And that is why we reivindicate our growing organization as of the base roots organizations, migrants, indigenous, Afro-descendants, union workers, and rural workers who challenge the language barriers and the structural inequalities that bring in poor quality of living as well as extreme poverty. We are used to repeating the Latin America, the Caribbean's most unequal region in the world. And now we will get used to saying that we're also the region with the largest number of feminists, the strongest feminist groups in the world. Our constant activism resisting all prejudice is seen in these fragile democracies where we see a conservative system that represses social unrest. We wish to defend our human rights. But defending our rights is even of high risk right now. We, in spite of all of that, resist. We are now having a cultural dispute where gender equality is facing risks of backpedaling in view of a capitalist, prejudiced, xenophobic system that is expressed in dangerous fundamentalism, whether it be of cultural, political, or religious nature. We are now asking for a lay system that will help us in the advancement of girls and women. And here we ratify the idea that democracy without discrimination and any kind of exclusion is a sine qua non for the exercise of citizenship and human rights. That is why we must ensure that the conditions that will permit participation of civil society, especially of feminist and women's organizations, is needed. We will continue to push ahead in approving Beijing. We have already made progress, but it's not enough. The challenges are still here, and they demand articulation between state, civil society, multilateral organizations, and others. That is why we request the states implement all agreements towards equality and the rights of women who, with enough budget that will allow for the policies to be implemented with progressive ideas for the redistribution of wealth. We demand free, legal, safe abortion in the whole region. Its penalization should be typified as a state violence because sexual and reproductive rights are human rights. We demand that women's bodies will no longer be a territory to be conquered. And we are against all kinds of repression, including violence as a tool for military and police control in the midst of the riots in our countries. And in view of the recent aggressions towards Chileans and Nicaraguan women and what's happening in our countries due to migration crisis, we demand that states be accountable vis-à-vis their international obligations, their recommendations as well of human rights institutions with which they have subscribed agreements. We demand that once and for all understand that this is unsustainable, that without justice, we cannot build peaceful societies. We urge states to ensure that political participation of women, whether they be lesbian, travestite, bisexual, trans, and non-binary, will be able to act without reprisal or violence. So we need a new institution that will ensure access to justice so that all women, especially Afro-descendants and indigenous women, may participate in the ruling of our countries with parity. All governments should realize that the models for development are now hindering the possibilities for women's economic autonomy. Girls, indigenous women, Afro-descendants, youngsters, migrants, women workers, including sexual workers, sexual general dissidents with disabilities that are HIV positive.
We urge to overcome institutional racism and xenophobia with policies with intersectional perspective, supporting public services and programs to protect Black girls and women, migrants and indigenous people, and others who suffer discrimination on account of race or ethnicity. We demand immediate response to climate change in all countries and special emphasis in the Caribbean. We need the necessary means to untangle these barriers to economic inclusion. We need decent, well-paid jobs and ensure food safety. We have a right to live free of harassment in sports and the care economy, responsible with ensuring access to quality public services, in comprehensive sexual education, health, and social infrastructure at all levels. We demand immediately moving towards the eradication of all forms of violence against women, especially femicide and harmful practices. And so we demand that sexual violence, unions and forced marriages and girls and adolescents should not continue. Ensuring a life free of violence is something that cannot be postponed. We demand immediate response to discrimination, violence, and harassment that women must face in the world of labor, especially journalists, because the transformation of the media and digital communication and the sexist way of addressing this is necessary for the cultural transformation that we aspire to. Beijing is still our agenda. Today, states say they do not want to leave anyone behind. It is us who do not accept any setback and will not allow us being left behind. So nothing about us without us. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Margot. Thank you. Very important discourse by this new youth. We have just over 45 minutes, and so we'll now recognize member delegations with more or less 3 to 4 minutes. So if you're interested, please raise your name tag and we will be recognized. Is there any delegation that would like to take the floor? Venezuela. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Once again, I'd like to thank you for the invitation to attend, and I would like to express on behalf of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela the intervention by the Minister of the Government of Brazil. The figures that she has presented gives us is information not backed or certified by any UN agency. That is propaganda that adds nothing to this forum. And likewise, we see with great concern the evident and demonstrable outbreaks of xenophobia in our continent, highly focused against Venezuelan women, even leading to outright violence that ends with their lives. Our country today hosts more than 8 million migrants, men and women. All receive the same treatment, decent, humanitarian, and equal, same as those born in Venezuela, in terms of housing, health, and education, with a great effort by our government. So we please take note of this comment, and especially because that is not the spirit in this arena. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Your comments will be included. Is there any other delegation interested in taking the floor? ILO, yes, go ahead. Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity. ILO greets the document presented to the conference and also the discussions held these days, and today's discussion on the path to Beijing plus 25. All recognize the relevance of a world of labor in order to achieve a more equitable world, and recognizing that closing the gaps of inequality has to do with more and better jobs for everyone. The young people have just backed this. That is the world they aspire to. These same goals have been given priority by governments, workers, and employers at the last International Labour Conference. In 2019, ILO celebrated its centenary, and it was an opportunity to reflect on the future of labor that we want. A commission was created. Rebecca Greenspan was part of the commission and discussed how to achieve a fairer future for everyone. The conference adopted the Centenary Declaration in order to determine the path to be followed by countries, by workers, employers, the organization, in order to achieve a better world in these changing scenarios, a better world in the face of technological, ecological, and social change, so that these changes may benefit all workers, for a future where people are at the center of our aims. This declaration emphasizes the need for a transforming, ambitious effort to ensure equality among men and women. There cannot be a fairer future without justice between men and women. This should include, the declaration says, a more balanced distribution of family responsibilities, a far more ambitious investment in care, commitment, far more serious commitment to equal treatment among all people, and equal pay for work of equal value. The conference also adopted Convention 190, mentioned today, regarding violence and harassment in the world of labor, that recognizes that violence and harassment in the workplace is a threat to human rights and affects women and girls disproportionately. And we should not create an artificial border between gender violence in the public and private spheres and violence in the workplace. We urge all countries to follow the example set by Uruguay, and as now has been said by Jamaica, to ratify this convention that recognizes workers as the subjects of human rights. I would like to strengthen The agreement in the statements of today and the Centenary Declaration, I believe that all agencies, all countries, Sahib has shown an agenda where we agree. I believe that we should be far more imaginative. We must return to our countries to see that, well, if we coincide in so many things, so many aims, if we agree on achieving a fairer future, if we agree on thinking that the world of labor and the participation of equitable participation of women in the world of labor is essential in order to achieve the SDGs and not leave anyone behind, we must think of new imaginative ways together and how we can work together to achieve these common goals. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Very interesting intervention by the ILO. UNICEF, please, you have the floor. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. UNICEF thanks and congratulates ECLAC, as well as UN Women, as well as the government of Chile, for holding this 14th Regional Conference on Women. We also congratulate ECLAC for the report on the autonomy of women in changing economic scenarios, as well as the reports on the implementation of the Montevideo Strategy and the Beijing Platform, nourished by national reports from countries that are members of this conference. Interventions held in today's panel from the countries and the discussions of yesterday, as well as statements by the civil society and the regional consultation of youth in Latin America and the Caribbean, have all highlighted the relevance of placing in the focus of the Santiago commitment all of these aspects. I do not wish to be repetitive. We would like to highlight 3 additional points. First, let's continue with statistical silence regarding adolescents, especially those aged 10 to 14, considering their diversity and intersectionality. We urgently need to improve information to make visible their lives, including the violence that they experience at home, digital space, the streets, school, public transport, and the institutions where girls and adolescents live. We urgently need information on femicide in this age group, their access to information, services, relationship between sexual violence, early pregnancy, school dropout, and early marriages, just to mention some areas where the silence in official information prevents the design of public policy to promote gender equality in the childhood agendas. And second, in relation to the report on the autonomy of women in changing economic scenarios, we highlight the following. The figures of women graduated in the areas of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics cannot be changed, if not without a change in the biases. And so, in these girls and adolescents in the first and second educational cycles, available data indicate that the percentage of people that neither study nor work is twice as high than among their male adolescents. This is affected by violence to and within the classrooms, the lack of inputs, infrastructure to manage their menstruation decently. Early unions, pregnancy, and relations and responsibilities at an early age at home, as well as curricular content that reproduces inequality. I'd like to dwell on early unions and to add a few other comments and the intervention by the regional director of UNFPA, just to emphasize that of the 25 years since Beijing, this region has not seen any reduction in the prevalence of child marriage and early union. 25 years without a change in this situation for girls and adolescents. Third, we know that the Beijing platform includes a critical area, the chapter on the girl called the girl, without necessarily considering the diversity that we've heard of here in these days, and considers nine strategic goals. Just before this session, we were talking among young people and different generations about the progress and stagnated areas in relation to the 9 strategic goals, and especially the ambiguity in terms of how to measure in a standard manner the progress or indicators of these 9 strategic goals. We hope that we may work together implementing the agreements of this conference, the previous ones, and the path towards the next 10 years, towards the 2030 agenda, and see how we could invest and standardize, how we're going to measure this progress in terms of meeting the chapter on the girl. And lastly, the agreements of this conference make up the regional gender agenda, as well as the consensus Montevideo strategy, the 2030 agenda, and the Beijing platform. We offer our support and collaboration in full to member states, as well as civil society, adolescents, young people, together with UN system agencies. We invite you to break the vicious and intergenerational cycle of gender violence. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. 3 major suggestions. We'll now recognize Guatemala, please. Yes, thank you very much. Truly, my comment is short. I would like to appreciate and congratulate youth and adolescents and children for taking part. Their voice is so important at this and other multilateral fora. The government of Guatemala is based precisely on principles in dialogue with these sectors, and especially Floridalma López from Guatemala, because with the parliament, we are in constant dialogue, and so we will continue to move ahead, promoting the agenda of this very important sector. Floridalma and all the young people with us here today, women and audience in general. Guatemala is a country with a young face of a woman, childhood and adolescence, and that is why we're working with them for the well-being of our country. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I see no one else has asked for the floor. FAO, sorry, you were just in front of me. Yes, please go ahead. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Claudia Brito, and I work for FAO, the UN agency that oversees We See No Hunger in Latin America. I'd like to congratulate ECLAC, Alicia, and in your name, everyone in this division, for the effort made to organize this conference that every 3 years provides an opportunity to hear all the sectors involved in this in our countries. And this is what we've done over the last 2 days, to hear what is it that governments have to say to us. What have civil society organizations come to say to us, as well as other sectors, such as ourselves, Cooperation for Development, and system agencies. I would also like to congratulate the ECLAC position document, because, as we said at the agency meeting, the document picks up, in one part at least, comprehensively, the situation of rural women in Latin America, and above all, the specific situation experienced by women in their own territories. And there I wish to dwell a moment because I believe that, well, I would like to pick up and put to you here a topic that we should pay attention to with regard to the conference, focusing investment efforts by states. What do I mean with this? If the issue, and 84 of the 132 SDG goals of the Beijing Action Platform, and the implications of this for Latin America, the conference and all the other conferences that we've held for the last 43 years, I'm as old as the first conference, regional conference. And every time I hear this accumulation of information being a spearhead in the international agreements, this makes me think of a certain maturity in this region in terms of all the topics addressed. Undoubtedly, there's a direct relation between this conference and what we want in future, focusing the action by the states and the effort of the UN system around those who need it most, rural women in Latin America. Look, just for you to get an idea of all this information that we've received here these days, we have evidence that rural poverty continues to unequally affect men and women in rural areas. The feminization of rural poverty has remained the same over the last 20 years. There's been no real change in the indicators. This, together with a situation of extreme violence, neither do we have information on sexual violence in rural areas. We are also seeing lack of access to public resources there. And I would like to underscore the relevance of focusing on this, because if we see that the state is a systemic set of efforts, we realize that the most relevant efforts are focused on social protection system as a minimum floor, as explained by ECLAC in recent years. Women in rural areas require that minimum floor of sexual protection. They require a systemic protection system. It is not possible for them to continue living in the violation of their economic rights and also in terms of their physical autonomy and decision-making. I think that one of the things that this conference has brought here is the need for this intersectionality and taking a far more closer look at territories, which is where policy is materialized. It's where the rubber hits the ground. Any effort made, if it's not in that way, will not have much impact. And so I would like to say that the situation of these women living in extreme poverty, each time harder poverty in rural areas, is what also keeps this region in its vulnerability in terms of the nutritional safety. Women in this region are affected by food safety. Many live in hunger right now, and that is unacceptable and is directly related to the need to focus public policy. And today we are discussing this here.
Secondly, when countries leave hunger behind, or in other countries where that still exists, we find that nutrition vulnerability goes to the other extreme. And now we see countries that have high levels of obesity, where women are the ones most affected by obesity. This region, 10 years after the 2030 agenda, cannot continue saying that we have women that are going to bed without having 3 meals a day. We cannot continue saying that we have one of the highest levels of women obese in the region. We must tackle this from the very beginning. So it's a systemic kind of emergency. And as of FAO, Alicia, colleagues in the system, governments here present, we have been devoting efforts to solve this situation. We call on change here, and I think the young people have much to say here. I congratulate you on the possibility to listen to the young people. I see Guatemalan, Bolivian young girls, people speaking in those countries that have such nutrition problems. FAO wishes to continue forward along these lines, supporting countries, and naturally, Alicia, Caribbean first. We're all behind you. These were great contributions to what Alicia spoke about this afternoon. Colombia, yes, go ahead. Good afternoon. I am very pleased to be here in this conference because of the wonderful discussions and all of the feedback we're taking home. I am now Presidential Counselor for Women's Affairs, and I'd like to take advantage of these few minutes to tell you about what's been happening in Colombia and the importance of these international agreements and these fora for the advancement of women. Under President Iván Duque and under the leadership of Marta Lucia, our Vice President, let me say that it's the first time where a development plan has a special chapter towards women's equality. And what have been the results? Colombia is now #1 in the world with a parity cabinet as recognized by the World Forum. And it is very important because aside from these figures, in our country we have 18 ministries. 10 of these are led by women. It's not just that, but there's also a strategic importance in terms of economic growth. For Colombia, right now, we have ministries that are being ruled by women in infrastructure, energy, education. And it's the first time that we have a woman in charge of political affairs. And first we have a vice president who's a woman. And why is this important? Because according to the president, we are mainstreaming gender. Let me tell you about a special policy that is already being implemented under this women's leadership. For example, the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation has just been created, and it's being ruled by an Afro-descendant woman. We've just created a fund to promote the access of girls into jobs. We know that we must continue in this. We have also worked together with the private sector. We've created the Presidential Advisory Committee made up by business women from all sectors, including the rural sector. And right now, they're working on giving the structures to specific projects to narrow down the gaps that we women face in Colombia and in Latin America. How do we reduce this unemployment? How to encourage entrepreneurship? How to make girls and women to study more professions, more women in the higher positions. We're decided in this path. We're also holding a big social dialogue with the women's organizations, with the productive sectors, and with the government in order to have policies focusing 5 elements of our agenda. Rural women, for example, these are one of the sectors that most suffer from violence. We have many challenges, yes. Progress has been made, and the Economic Forum recognizes that Colombia is one of the countries that has done things in terms of parity, but it's not enough. It's not enough. And as I said yesterday, our big challenge, we have a big challenge ahead of us. When we listen to the results of this forum, it would seem like economic gaps between men and women tells us that we're about 250 years away. We must act decisively in implementing public policies to get rid of this. In Colombia, we fully believe that where there's a woman that can work without any kind of limitation, a woman who can become an entrepreneur, study whatever she wants to study, with the possibility of being part of a board of directors, who can be chosen as a director both in the private and public sector, a woman free of violence. That is a woman in an economy that grows with equity, that reduces inequality, that goes forward, and that brings well-being to all of its society. Welcome you all. I really enjoy being here from Colombia. We have learned a great deal, and we will continue going forward with this agenda to give economic autonomy for women. Thank you. Thank you. Two persons have requested the floor from an organization from Marta from Mexico. I am Maria Jose Lubertina from the Latin American Caribbean Network. I come from Argentina. Let me first of all thank my delegation for the opportunity of being part of this delegation on behalf of civil society. I also wish to thank the inspiring reports brought to us by many of you, and Lisa's words as well. First of all, I'd like to make an appeal to the countries in the region to sign and to ratify the international treaties from the Inter-American System on Human Rights. Some still have not ratified that. I emphasize the San Salvador Protocol and Escazú Agreement. These are extremely important for the women in the region. We believe that there's something pending in many important countries in the region. In view of the important interventions by Rebecca and Alicia having to do with economic issues, when women speak against the extraction industry, we're talking also about the financial extraction. What are the responsibilities in the hands of the international organizations, from the financial system, UN, and many of the consequences we're living through in our countries? We see so much debt, standing debt. It would be interesting to find out the costs and the consequences for women in the region. Many of the policies that were suggested by IMF, World Bank, and others, we do have our own doubts. We have our differences in terms of many of the policies that are being adopted by the WTO. For example, in patenting seeds and biodiversity. These are things that we, Native women, those that defend the environment and good life, are really striving to get rid of that, because we like, yes, talking about the environment, but the various systems themselves sponsor and support public policy that go against this, and it will certainly hurt the population in these areas. What I'd like to emphasize here, and it's something that I'd like to underscore, because at the forefront of much of this struggle, we find women out there in the different territories, often indigenous, rural women, but also urban organized women. We would like that agrotoxic substances be eliminated, as well as food sovereignty. We don't want any more mining with cyanide in Latin America, nor do we want any fracking. We don't want any deforestation, nor patent of seeds, nor segmentation of wetlands for the speculation of furniture manufacturing. These are some of the things that we find fundamental when we talk about no to extraction. There must be a good public policy implementation against this extraction. Agüita Cárceles is a symbol for us, but we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of women who are risking their lives with loneliness, anguish, without any government coverage and protection. Thank you. Thank you. Marta from Mexico, you have the floor.
Nanmochan ni papakipampa uantiasico anmextlatlautia. Yo les hablo en una de las.
This is one of the 86 native languages that we have in Mexico. There was the language Nahuatl. The region has 420 of these. It's important to mention, therefore, that we are losing some of these languages, and these are indigenous mother tongues. I believe that if we're losing these indigenous native tongues, we're also losing indigenous women, and they have no encouragement to teach these languages to the boys and girls. And why? Because for the future, they don't see any benefit in that, and we're just missing out on such an important part of our lives. These are languages that have survived for hundreds and hundreds of years, and we're going to be losing all of that in this 21st century. I think that this is an important value. The International Year of Indigenous Year last year will certainly become also a year for the protection under UNESCO. But this is something I wanted to bring to you, Alicia. I heard you said that diversity is the greatest wealth we have. Biological, cultural diversity, and languages is something that is most forgotten amongst everything else. We can protect a species more than our own language, and this is very important for Mexico and for the region. No one will depend this better than we in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I hope that this will be part of our conclusions. Thank you.
Muy bien, Marta.
Thank you, Marta. We're doing so in Chile. CONADI and CENAMEX, they're both working here in Chile precisely to that purpose of recovering Aymara, Pascuense languages. Mapungu is being worked well by our Machis, but in talking about the others, it's been very difficult, as you yourself said. Well, we've been present in this effort. Now, amongst the delegations, the question is, would anybody else want to hold the floor? Very well, then we'll close this, thanking ECLAC, UN Women, for this extraordinary afternoon with a lot of passion, intelligence, and love for the change we need in our world. So we adjourn until tomorrow at 9 a.m. Have a pleasant evening.